In the autumn of 1901, when Manchester's mill chimneys pierced the grey sky like accusatory fingers, there came to light a case that would test the very foundations of rational thought. The industrial smoke that shrouded Chawton-cum-Hardy seemed to carry whispers of the past, settling like ash upon the present. In those narrow streets where respectability was worn like armor against the encroaching darkness of the new century, a child's voice would speak truths that no living soul should know. The waters of memory, it seemed, ran deeper than the Mersey itself, carrying with them the weight of deaths that refused to remain buried. What follows is an account drawn from records that many wished had never been kept, testimonies that challenged the very nature of existence itself. The first indication that Mary Ann Cotterill was not as other children came on a Tuesday morning in September when the autumn mist clung to the cobblestones of Chawton-cum-Hardy like the breath of the dead. Miss Edith Vale, a woman of 29 years whose dedication to education had earned her both respect and the quiet pity reserved for spinsters, noticed the child standing motionless by the classroom window, her small fingers pressed against the glass as if trying to reach through to something beyond. The other children chattered and played, their voices creating the familiar symphony of childhood that had always brought Miss Vale such comfort, yet Mary Ann remained apart, her dark eyes fixed upon the grey sky with an intensity that seemed to belong to someone far older. When Miss Vale approached, intending to draw the child back into the lesson, Mary Ann turned with a solemnity that struck the teacher like a physical blow. "I remember drowning," the child said, her voice carrying the weight of absolute certainty. "4 times, Miss Vale. I remember drowning 4 times. The words hung in the air between them, like smoke from the distant mill chimneys, acrid and impossible to ignore. Miss Vale, whose rational mind had been shaped by years of Methodist teaching and the progressive educational theories of the day, felt something cold settle in her stomach as she looked into Mary Ann's eyes. There was no childish fancy there, no imagination run wild with tales from penny dreadfuls or ghost stories whispered in the schoolyard. Instead, there was a terrible knowledge, a certainty that seemed to reach back through years the child had never lived. The classroom around them continued its gentle bustle. Children bent over their slates, the scratch of chalk and the rustle of pinafores creating a normalcy that suddenly felt as fragile as morning frost. Miss Vale knelt beside the child, her practical woolen skirt spreading around her like a dark pool, and found herself asking the question that would haunt her for years to come. "What do you mean, Mary Ann?" she whispered, though part of her already dreaded the answer. The child's response came without hesitation, delivered in the same matter-of-fact tone she might use to recite her multiplication tables. "The water was so cold, Miss Vale, and each time I tried so hard to breathe." The implications of the child's words settled over Miss Vale like the industrial soot that coated every surface in Manchester, leaving a residue that could never quite be scrubbed clean. She had taught children for nearly a decade, had seen them through their fears and fancies, their nightmares and their joys, yet never had she encountered anything that chilled her quite so thoroughly. Mary Ann Cotterill was not a fanciful child. Indeed, she was known for her quiet demeanor and her careful attention to facts. Her family, though not wealthy, were respectable folk who attended chapel regularly and kept their small terraced house as neat as a pin. There was nothing in the child's background to suggest a tendency toward elaborate fabrication or morbid imagination, yet here she stood, speaking of drowning with the casual certainty of someone recounting a walk to the market. Miss Vale found herself studying the child's face, searching for some sign of deception or confusion, but Mary Ann's expression remained unchanged, her dark eyes holding depths that seemed to reflect experiences far beyond her 9 years. The teacher's hands trembled slightly as she reached out to touch the child's shoulder, feeling the solid warmth of living flesh beneath the rough cotton of her dress. As the morning progressed, Miss Vale found herself unable to concentrate on the lessons at hand, her attention continually drawn back to Mary Ann, who had returned to her seat and was now bent over her copybook with the same quiet diligence she always displayed. The child's penmanship was careful and precise, each letter formed with the methodical attention that spoke of a mind far more ordered than most children possessed. Yet beneath this surface normalcy, Miss Vale sensed something else, a current of knowledge that ran deep and dark as the waters Mary Ann claimed to remember. The other children seemed oblivious to any change in their classmate, continuing their work and play with the easy unconsciousness of youth, Yet Miss Vale found herself watching them with new eyes, wondering what secrets might lie hidden behind their innocent faces. The autumn light that filtered through the tall windows seemed different now, carrying with it shadows that had not been there before, and the familiar sounds of the classroom took on an almost ominous quality. When the bell rang for the midday meal, Miss Vale remained at her desk long after the children had filed out, staring at the empty chair where Mary Ann had sat, and wondering what forces had conspired to place such terrible knowledge in the mind of a child. The decision to seek outside help did not come easily to Miss Vale, for she was a woman who prided herself on her ability to handle whatever challenges her pupils might present. Yet, as the days passed and Mary Ann's strange pronouncements continued, each one delivered with the same unsettling certainty, the teacher found herself increasingly out of her depth. The child spoke of water with an intimacy that suggested personal experience, describing the sensation of drowning with a precision that no 9-year-old should possess. She knew the weight of waterlogged clothing, the burning in lungs desperate for air, the gradual dimming of consciousness as life ebbed away. More disturbing still were the details she provided about the circumstances of these supposed deaths, speaking of different times and places with a specificity that suggested either an extraordinary imagination or something far more troubling. Miss Vale had begun to keep a careful record of the child's statements, writing them down in her neat teacher's hand and storing them in a locked drawer of her desk. The pages accumulated like evidence of some crime against nature, each one adding weight to a growing conviction that Mary Ann Cotterill was not simply a child with an overactive imagination. It was on a particularly grey Thursday, when the smoke from the mills hung so thick that the sun seemed little more than a pale smudge against the sky, that Miss Vale made her decision to contact Dr. Lionel Barker. The doctor's reputation as a practitioner of hypnotism had reached even the modest circles in which Miss Vale moved, and though she harbored deep reservations about such unconventional methods, she could think of no other course of action. The child's behavior had begun to affect the entire classroom, her strange pronouncements creating an atmosphere of unease that even the youngest pupils seemed to sense. Parents had begun to ask questions, their voices carrying the particular tone of concern that suggested they were considering removing their children from Miss Vale's care. The teacher found herself caught between her duty to her pupils and her growing conviction that Mary Ann's case required investigation by someone with expertise far beyond her own. As she penned the letter to Dr. Barker, her hand steady despite the turmoil in her mind, Miss Vale could not shake the feeling that she was opening a door that might prove impossible to close again. Dr. Lionel Barker arrived at the school on a Monday morning when the October wind carried the scent of coal smoke and dying leaves through the narrow streets of Chorlton-cum-Hardy. He was a man of 54 years, his bearing marked by the confidence that came from decades of medical practice, yet there was something in his pale blue eyes that suggested he had seen things that challenged the very foundations of scientific understanding. His reputation as a hypnotist had been built carefully over many years, each case documented with the meticulous attention to detail that had made him both respected and slightly feared among his colleagues. The leather bag he carried contained not only the traditional instruments of his trade, but also notebooks filled with observations that pushed the boundaries of accepted medical knowledge. As he walked through the school's corridors, his footsteps echoing against the worn wooden floors, Dr. Barker found himself wondering what manner of case Miss Vale had presented to him, for her letter had been both urgent and deliberately vague, speaking of a child whose statements defied rational explanation. The meeting between doctor and patient took place in the small room that served as Miss Vale's office, a space made intimate by its collection of educational texts and the faint scent of chalk dust that seemed to permeate every surface. Mary Ann sat in a chair that was slightly too large for her small frame, her feet not quite touching the floor, yet there was nothing childlike in the way she regarded Dr. Barker as he entered. Her dark eyes held a gravity that seemed to weigh upon the very air around her, and when she spoke her greeting, her voice carried the same unsettling certainty that had so disturbed Miss Vale. "You've come to ask me about the drowning," she said, not as a question but as a simple statement of fact. Dr. Barker, who had encountered many unusual cases in his career, felt a chill run down his spine at the child's directness. He had expected to find a nervous or confused child, perhaps one suffering from some form of hysteria or delusion. Yet Mary Ann displayed none of the symptoms he had learned to associate with such conditions. Instead, She seemed to possess a clarity of mind that was almost unnerving in its intensity. The initial examination proceeded according to Dr. Barker's established protocols, yet from the very beginning it was clear that this case would challenge every assumption he had made about the nature of memory and consciousness. Mary Ann answered his questions with a precision that suggested not only intelligence, but a depth of experience that should have been impossible for someone of her age. When he asked her to describe her earliest memory, she spoke not of childhood experiences, but of sinking beneath dark water, her small hands moving as if she were still trying to swim toward a surface that remained forever out of reach. The details she provided were not the vague impressions one might expect from a child's imagination, but specific, visceral descriptions that spoke of genuine experience. She knew the taste of river water, the way clothing became heavy and restrictive when waterlogged, the particular quality of light that filtered down through murky depths. Dr. Barker found himself taking notes with increasing urgency, his usual calm demeanor giving way to something approaching excitement as he realized he might be witnessing something unprecedented in medical literature. As the session progressed, Dr. Barker began to employ the techniques of hypnotism that had made his reputation, guiding Mary Ann into a state of relaxed consciousness that would allow her to access memories more clearly. Yet what emerged under hypnosis was not the clarification he had expected, but rather a deepening of the mystery that surrounded the child. In her altered state, Mary Ann spoke with voices that seemed to belong to different people entirely, each one describing a death by drowning with heartbreaking clarity. There was Sarah, who had fallen through ice on a frozen pond in the winter of 1847, her cries for help going unheard in the bitter cold. There was Margaret, who had been swept away by floodwaters in the spring of 1863, her last sight being the roof of her cottage, disappearing beneath the rushing torrent. Each identity that emerged carried with it not only the memory of death but also fragments of life, details about families and homes and daily routines that painted vivid pictures of existence in times and places that Mary Ann had never known. Dr. Barker found himself struggling to maintain his professional composure as he listened to these accounts, each one delivered with an emotional authenticity that seemed to transcend mere performance. The most disturbing aspect of the session was not the content of Mary Ann's revelations, but the way in which they seemed to affect her physically. As she spoke of each drowning, her breathing became labored, her skin taking on a pallor that suggested genuine distress. At one point, she began to cough violently as if trying to expel water from her lungs, and Dr. Barker was forced to bring her out of the hypnotic state for fear that she might actually harm herself. When Mary Ann returned to normal consciousness, she seemed drained and confused, as if she had been pulled back from some distant shore against her will. The child looked at Dr. Barker with eyes that held a mixture of gratitude and sorrow, and when she spoke, her voice was barely above a whisper. "They're still there," she said, her small hand pressed against her chest. "All of them, still trying to breathe." The doctor found himself at a loss for words, his scientific training warring with the evidence of his own senses as he struggled to comprehend what he had witnessed. The implications of the session weighed heavily upon Dr. Barker as he prepared to leave the school, his mind racing with possibilities that challenged everything he thought he knew about the nature of human consciousness. He had built his career upon the premise that the mind was a rational instrument, capable of being understood and treated through scientific methods, yet Mary Ann's case suggested the existence of phenomena that lay far beyond the reach of conventional medicine. The child's knowledge of historical events, her intimate familiarity with the experience of drowning, and the physical manifestations that accompanied her revelations all pointed towards something that defied easy explanation. As he walked through the grey streets of Chorlton-cum-Hardy, the smoke from the mill chimneys seeming to press down upon him like a physical weight, Dr. Barker found himself questioning not only his understanding of this particular case, but the very foundations of his profession. The notebook in his bag contained observations that would either make his reputation or destroy it entirely, and he was not yet certain which outcome he preferred. The investigation that followed Dr. Barker's initial examination led him down paths that no respectable physician should have been compelled to travel, yet the evidence demanded nothing less than a complete abandonment of conventional methodology. Armed with the names and dates that Mary Ann had provided during her hypnotic sessions, the doctor found himself in the musty archives of St. Clement's Church, surrounded by parish registers that stretched back through decades of births, marriages, and deaths. The rector, a thin man whose pale complexion suggested too many years spent among dusty tomes, regarded Dr. Barker with the particular suspicion reserved for those who sought to disturb the peaceful slumber of the past. Yet when the doctor explained his purpose, speaking in carefully measured terms about a medical case that required historical verification, the rector's expression shifted from suspicion to something approaching fascination. The records, he explained, were meticulous in their detail, for the Victorian obsession with documentation had ensured that every significant event in the parish was recorded with bureaucratic precision. The first name that Dr. Barker sought was Sarah Whitmore, the identity that Mary Ann had assumed during her description of drowning beneath winter ice. The search through the registers of 1847 proved both tedious and revelatory. Each page turned revealing the careful script of long-dead clerks who had recorded the daily tragedies and triumphs of their community. When the entry was finally located, Dr. Barker felt his breath catch in his throat, for there, written in fading brown ink, was the record of Sarah Whitmore's death, aged 7 years, drowned in Chorlton Brook on the 15th of January, 1847. The circumstances matched Mary Ann's account with unsettling precision. The child had been playing near the frozen water when the ice gave way. Her body recovered 3 days later by men who had to break through the ice that had reformed over her grave. The rector, peering over Dr. Barker's shoulder, made a soft sound of surprise, for he had served this parish for nearly 2 decades, yet had never heard tell of this particular tragedy. The record was there, indisputable in its stark finality, yet it had been forgotten by all save the child who claimed to remember dying. The second verification proved even more disturbing, for Margaret Ashworth's death in the floods of 1863 had been recorded not only in the parish register, but also in the local newspaper, a copy of which the rector produced from a collection of historical documents that few had ever bothered to examine. The Manchester Guardian's account of the spring floods painted a picture of devastation that had claimed dozens of lives, yet Margaret's death was mentioned only in passing, a single line among many that recorded the toll of nature's fury. She had been 23 years old, a mill worker who lived in one of the terraced houses that lined the banks of the Mersey, and when the waters rose with unprecedented speed, she had been trapped in her cottage with no means of escape. The newspaper described how her body had been found days later, caught in the branches of a tree that had been uprooted by the flood, her face peaceful despite the violence of her death. Dr. Barker read the account with growing unease, for Mary Ann had described not only the manner of Margaret's death, but also the sensation of being carried by the current, the desperate struggle against the rushing water, and the final moment of surrender that had brought an end to her suffering. As the afternoon wore on and more records were examined, a pattern began to emerge that challenged not only Dr. Barker's understanding of the case, but his very conception of reality itself. Each name that Mary Ann had provided during her hypnotic sessions corresponded to a real person who had died by drowning in the Manchester area, their deaths separated by years or even decades, yet united by the terrible commonality of their final moments. There was Elizabeth Hartwell, who had fallen from a bridge into the Irwell in 1871. Her death ruled a suicide, though the circumstances suggested otherwise. There was young Thomas Brennan, who had drowned in a mill pond in 1885, his body discovered by workers who had come to begin their morning shift. Each case was documented with the bureaucratic thoroughness that characterized Victorian record-keeping, yet none of the deaths had been connected until now, when a 9-year-old child had somehow gained access to memories that should have died with their original owners. The rector, initially skeptical of Dr. Barker's unusual research, had grown increasingly pale as each verification was completed, his faith in the natural order of things shaken by evidence that suggested the boundaries between life and death were far more permeable than he had ever imagined. The most chilling discovery came near the end of their search, when Dr. Barker located the record of a death that Mary Ann had not yet described in detail, but had mentioned in passing during one of her sessions. The entry was brief, almost perfunctory in its brevity, yet it carried with it implications that made the doctor's hands tremble as he read. Mary Ann Cotterill, aged 6 years, drowned in the Mersey on the 3rd of August, 1898. The child whose memories they were investigating had apparently died 3 years before her current incarnation was born. her death recorded with the same bureaucratic precision as all the others. Dr. Barker stared at the entry for long minutes, his mind struggling to process the implications of what he was seeing. The rector, reading over his shoulder, made the sign of the cross and stepped back from the register as if it had suddenly become contaminated with something unholy. The silence that followed was broken only by the distant sound of church bells, their bronze voices calling the faithful to evening prayer. Yet their familiar comfort seemed hollow in the face of evidence that suggested the very foundations of Christian doctrine might be built upon incomplete understanding. The journey back to his surgery, through the darkening streets of Manchester, felt like a passage through a landscape that had been fundamentally altered by the day's discoveries. Dr. Barker carried with him not only his notebook filled with verified facts, but also copies of the parish records that the rector had reluctantly provided, each document serving as evidence of a phenomenon that medical science was ill-equipped to explain. The gas lamps that lined the streets cast pools of yellow light that seemed insufficient to dispel the shadows that had gathered around his understanding of the world, and the familiar sounds of the city took on an ominous quality that spoke of mysteries hidden beneath the surface of everyday life. As he walked, Dr. Barker found himself wondering how many other children might carry within them the memories of lives that had ended in tragedy, their voices silenced by a society that preferred to believe in the comfortable certainties of rational explanation. The case of Mary Ann Cotterill had opened a door that could never be closed again, revealing vistas of possibility that were both wondrous and terrifying in their implications. The evening found Dr. Barker in his study, surrounded by the evidence he had gathered and struggling to formulate a theory that might encompass the facts without destroying his sanity in the process. The medical journals that lined his shelves seemed suddenly inadequate, their confident assertions about the nature of consciousness and memory rendered meaningless by the testimony of a child who remembered dying 4 times. Outside his window, the city continued its nightly routine, unaware that one of its most respected physicians was grappling with evidence that suggested the very nature of existence might be far stranger than anyone had dared to imagine. The notebook lay open before him, its pages filled with observations that would either revolutionize medical understanding or consign him to the ranks of charlatans and madmen, and Dr. Barker was no longer certain which fate he preferred. The weeks that followed Dr. Barker's discoveries in the parish archives were marked by a growing sense of isolation that seemed to settle over all those involved in Mary Ann's case, like the perpetual smoke that shrouded Manchester's industrial landscape. Miss Vale found herself unable to look at her young pupil without feeling a chill that had nothing to do with the approaching winter, while Dr. Barker struggled with the implications of evidence that challenged every principle upon which his career had been built. The child herself seemed largely unaware of the turmoil her revelations had caused, continuing to attend school with the same quiet diligence she'd always displayed. Yet there were moments when her dark eyes would fix upon some distant point, and her lips would move as if she were carrying on conversations with invisible companions. The other children had begun to avoid her, their natural instincts warning them away from something they could not understand, and Mary Ann's isolation became as complete as if she had been marked by some visible sign of otherworldly contact. Dr. Barker's attempts to share his findings with colleagues met with reactions that ranged from polite skepticism to outright hostility, for the medical establishment of 1901 was not prepared to entertain theories that suggested consciousness might survive bodily death, or that memories could somehow transfer from one individual to another. The evidence he presented was dismissed as coincidence or fraud, his reputation suffering as word of his unusual research spread through the professional community. Yet the doctor found himself unable to abandon the case, driven by a compulsion that seemed to come from beyond his own rational mind to continue his investigation despite the personal cost. He began to spend long hours in Mary Ann's company, conducting session after session of hypnotic regression that revealed ever more disturbing details about the lives and deaths she claimed to remember. Each revelation was carefully documented and verified where possible, creating a body of evidence that was both undeniable and impossible to accept within the framework of conventional understanding. The child's physical condition began to deteriorate as the sessions continued, her small frame seeming to bear the weight of memories that belonged to others. She complained of constant fatigue and spoke of dreams in which she was always drowning, always struggling toward a surface that remained forever out of reach. Miss Vale, watching her pupil grow pale and withdrawn, began to question whether the investigation was worth the obvious toll it was taking on Mary Ann's health. Yet when she raised these concerns with Dr. Barker, the physician's response revealed the depth of his obsession with the case. He spoke of the potential significance of their discoveries, of the possibility that they were witnessing evidence of phenomena that could revolutionize human understanding of consciousness and death. The teacher found herself caught between her duty to protect her pupil and her growing conviction that Mary Ann's case represented something far more important than the welfare of a single child. The breakthrough that Dr. Barker had been seeking came during a session in late November, when the first snows of winter had begun to dust the grimy streets of Manchester with a deceptive purity that could not disguise the industrial squalor beneath. Mary Ann, under deep hypnosis, began to speak in a voice that was different from any of the previous personalities that had emerged during their sessions. This voice belonged to someone older, someone who spoke with the authority of years and experience, and the words that came from the child's lips carried with them a terrible wisdom that seemed to encompass not only the individual deaths she had described, but the larger pattern of which they were a part. The entity that spoke through Mary Ann claimed to be a guardian of sorts, a consciousness that had taken upon itself the task of preserving the memories of those who had died before their time. The drowning victims whose experiences Mary Ann carried were not random selections, but souls who had been chosen for the intensity of their final moments, their deaths serving as anchors that prevented their memories from fading into the oblivion that claimed most human experience. The implications of this revelation struck Dr. Barker with the force of a physical blow, for it suggested that Mary Ann was not simply a child with unusual memories, but rather a vessel for something far more significant. The guardians spoke of other children like Mary Ann, scattered across the world and carrying within them the preserved experiences of the dead, their young minds serving as repositories for memories that would otherwise be lost forever. Each child was connected to the others through bonds that transcended physical distance, their shared burden creating a network of consciousness that spanned continents and centuries. The purpose of this preservation was not immediately clear, but the guardian hinted at a greater design, a plan that required the memories of the dead to be maintained until some future time when they would be needed for purposes that mortal minds could not yet comprehend. Dr. Barker listened to these revelations with a mixture of fascination and horror, realizing that he had stumbled upon something that dwarfed his original investigation in both scope and significance. The session ended abruptly when Mary Ann began to convulse, her small body racked by spasms that seemed to originate from some source beyond physical illness. Dr. Barker worked frantically to bring her out of the hypnotic state, his medical training warring with his growing conviction that conventional treatments would be useless against whatever forces were at work within the child. When Mary Ann finally opened her eyes, they held a depth of exhaustion that seemed to encompass lifetimes of suffering, and when she spoke, her voice was barely audible above the wind that rattled the windows of the small room. "They're getting stronger," she whispered, her small hand clutching at Dr. Barker's sleeve with desperate intensity. "The memories are getting stronger, and I don't know how much longer I can hold them all." The doctor found himself at a loss for words, his scientific training providing no framework for understanding what was happening to the child, much less for treating it. As he looked into Mary Ann's eyes, he saw not the innocent gaze of a 9-year-old, but the accumulated wisdom and sorrow of all those whose memories she carried, and he realized with growing horror that he might be witnessing the slow destruction of a child's sanity under the weight of experiences that no single mind was meant to bear. The winter of 1902 descended upon Chorlton-cum-Hardy with a peculiar heaviness, as though the very air had grown thick with unspoken testimonies. Dr. Barker found himself walking the same streets that Mary Ann had described in her fevered recollections, noting how the gaslight fell differently now, how shadows seemed to pool in doorways with deliberate intent. The mill workers passed him with lowered eyes, their faces bearing the particular pallor of those who had heard whispers they wished they could unhear. In the public houses, conversations ceased when his name was mentioned, replaced by the careful sipping of ale and the studied examination of worn wooden tables. The girl's words had taken root in the collective consciousness of the district, spreading like damp through the walls of respectability that the community had so carefully constructed. Each morning brought fresh reports of sleepless nights, of children asking questions their parents could not answer, of wives finding their husbands staring into fires with expressions of profound unease. Miss Vale had taken to visiting the parish records with increasing frequency, her delicate fingers tracing through baptismal registers and burial records with the methodical precision of one seeking either vindication or absolution. The elderly clerk, Mr. Pemberton, watched her with growing concern as she requested access to documents spanning decades, her searches becoming ever more specific, ever more desperate. She would arrive each morning with a list of names written in her careful script, names that Mary Ann had whispered during those terrible sessions when the past seemed to bleed through into the present. The musty scent of old parchment and fading ink became her constant companion, mingling with the lavender water she wore to mask the growing anxiety that seemed to emanate from her very pores. Her colleagues at the school began to notice the dark circles beneath her eyes, the way her hands trembled when she held the chalk, the manner in which she would pause mid-sentence as though listening to voices only she could hear. The children in her care sensed the change in their beloved teacher, their usual chatter subdued by an instinctive understanding that something fundamental had shifted in their ordered world. Mary Ann herself had grown quieter, though not in the manner of a child who had forgotten her troubles. Rather, she carried herself with the peculiar gravity of one who had been forced to bear witness to truths too large for her small frame to contain. Her mother, Mrs. Cotterill, found herself watching the girl with a mixture of protective love and growing dread, noting how Mary Ann would sometimes pause in her play to stare at nothing, her young face wearing expressions that belonged to someone far older, far more weary. The other children in the neighborhood had begun to avoid her, not from cruelty, but from the primitive wisdom that warns the young away from mysteries that might contaminate their innocence. She would sit by her bedroom window in the evenings, gazing out at the gaslit streets with eyes that seemed to hold the accumulated weight of multiple lifetimes. Her drawings, once filled with the bright simplicity of childhood, had taken on a darker quality, depicting scenes of water and shadow, of figures reaching upward from depths that seemed to have no bottom. Mrs. Cotterill had hidden these sketches away, unable to bear the sight of such profound melancholy rendered in a child's uncertain hand. The medical establishment in Manchester had begun to take notice of Dr. Barker's case, though their interest was tempered by the kind of professional skepticism that serves as both shield and sword against uncomfortable possibilities. Letters arrived daily at his practice, some offering collaboration, others questioning his methods with the barely concealed hostility of those whose worldview had been challenged. He found himself defending not merely his techniques, but the very nature of memory itself, arguing before audiences of learned men who listened with the polite attention reserved for colleagues who might be suffering from overwork or nervous exhaustion. The weight of their collective doubt pressed upon him like a physical force, making each morning's journey to his consulting rooms feel like a walk to the gallows. Yet he could not abandon Mary Ann, could not dismiss the evidence of his own senses, could not pretend that the child's knowledge was anything other than genuine. The responsibility of being perhaps the only adult willing to believe her testimony had begun to age him visibly, his once confident bearing replaced by the careful movements of a man walking on uncertain ground. The community of Chorlton-cum-Hardy had developed its own methods of coping with the unsettling presence of Mary Ann Cotterill and her impossible memories. Conversations would halt when she passed, resuming only after she had moved beyond earshot, as though her very proximity might somehow contaminate the comfortable certainties of daily life. The local clergy found themselves fielding questions they had never expected to address, inquiries about the nature of the soul and the possibility of its return that challenged the neat boundaries of orthodox theology. Sunday services took on a different quality, the familiar hymns and prayers seeming to carry additional weight, as though the congregation was seeking reassurance against possibilities they dared not name. The mill owners, practical men concerned with profit and productivity, nevertheless found themselves troubled by the way their workers spoke of the girl, the manner in which productivity seemed to falter whenever her story was discussed. Even the most rational among them could not entirely dismiss the growing sense that something fundamental about the nature of existence had been called into question within their orderly industrial world. The approaching spring brought no relief from the psychological burden that had settled over the district like a persistent fog. If anything, The lengthening days seemed only to illuminate more clearly the shadows that had taken residence in the collective consciousness of Chorlton-cum-Hardy. Dr. Barker continued his sessions with Mary Ann, though each meeting left him more convinced that he was documenting something that challenged the very foundations of human understanding. Miss Vale persisted in her archival research, her discoveries growing ever more disturbing as she uncovered records that seemed to corroborate the child's impossible recollections. The girl herself remained at the center of this growing storm of uncertainty, a small figure bearing the weight of mysteries that threatened to overwhelm not merely her own young mind, but the carefully constructed rationality of an entire community. The question was no longer whether Mary Ann's memories were real, but whether the world was prepared to accept the implications of their reality. Miss Vale's research had led her into the deepest recesses of Manchester's municipal records, where documents yellow with age held secrets that seemed to pulse with malevolent life. The basement archives of the town hall had become her second home, a subterranean realm where the accumulated weight of bureaucratic documentation created its own oppressive atmosphere. Here, among the carefully catalogued testimonies of coroners and the methodical reports of police constables, she had begun to piece together a pattern that defied every rational explanation her educated mind could provide. The gas lamps flickered with irregular rhythm in these depths, casting dancing shadows that seemed to mock her efforts to impose order upon chaos. Each file she opened revealed another fragment of a puzzle whose completion threatened to shatter her understanding of the natural world. The musty scent of decaying paper had become so familiar that she could no longer detect it, though visitors to her lodgings remarked upon the way it seemed to cling to her clothing like an accusation. The first death had occurred in 1847, a mill girl named Sarah Whitmore, who had drowned in the Mersey during the spring floods. The coroner's report, written in the careful copperplate of Victorian officialdom, described a body recovered 3 days after the initial disappearance, the face so damaged by immersion that identification had relied upon the testimony of fellow workers who recognized a distinctive scar upon the left hand. Miss Vale had read this document dozens of times, noting how the clinical language failed to capture the human tragedy it described, the way bureaucratic precision served to distance the reader from the reality of a young life extinguished. Yet it was the marginal notes, added in a different hand, that had first caught her attention. Observations about the girl's final words, her apparent premonition of drowning, her insistence in the days before her death that she had experienced the sensation before. The investigating constable had dismissed these details as the superstitious ramblings of uneducated factory workers, but Miss Vale recognized in them the same quality of desperate certainty that characterized Mary Ann's recollections. The second case dated from 1863, another drowning, this time in the canal that ran behind the cotton mills. Margaret Henley, aged 16, had been found floating face down near the lock gates, her body bearing no signs of violence save those inflicted by the water itself. The circumstances were remarkably similar. A young woman who had spoken of dreams of drowning, who had exhibited an inexplicable fear of water in the weeks preceding her death, who had confided to her sister that she felt as though she had died before. The sister's testimony, preserved in the police files, described Margaret's final evening in terms that made Miss Vale's hands tremble as she transcribed them. The girl had spoken of remembering other faces, other names, other deaths, her words dismissed by her family as the product of an overwrought imagination. Yet the precision of her descriptions, the specific details she provided about drowning sensations she should never have experienced, created an uncomfortable parallel with Mary Ann's own testimonies. The investigating officers had noted these peculiarities, but had lacked any framework within which to interpret them, filing them away as curiosities rather than clues. Dr. Barker had joined Miss Vale in her archival investigations, his medical training providing a different perspective on the accumulated evidence. Together, they had uncovered the third case, Emma Bradshaw, drowned in 1879 in the reservoir that supplied water to the expanding suburbs of Manchester. The post-mortem examination, conducted with the thoroughness that marked the later Victorian period, had revealed no obvious cause for the drowning beyond the simple fact of immersion. Yet the testimony of witnesses painted a picture of a young woman in the grip of some inexplicable compulsion, walking into the water with the deliberate movements of one following a predetermined path. Her employer, a respectable family in Didsbury, had reported that Emma had been speaking for weeks of water dreams, of sensations of drowning that came upon her without warning, of a growing conviction that she was meant to die by water. The family had attributed these statements to nervous exhaustion, recommending rest and prayer as remedies for what they assumed to be a temporary affliction of the mind. The irony of their well-intentioned dismissal was not lost upon Dr. Barker, who recognized in their response the same protective skepticism he encountered daily in his professional circles. The fourth death was the most recent and, in many ways, the most disturbing. Alice Morrison had drowned in 1895, just 6 years before Mary Ann's birth, in the very stretch of the Irwell that the child had described with such haunting accuracy. The police investigation had been more thorough than its predecessors, reflecting the improved methods of the 1890s, yet it had reached the same inconclusive verdict: accidental death by drowning, cause unknown. Alice had been employed as a seamstress in one of the better establishments in Manchester, a young woman of good character and steady habits who had given no indication of suicidal intent. Yet her landlady had reported the same pattern of water dreams, the same expressions of inexplicable dread, the same conviction that she had experienced drowning before. The investigating sergeant had noted these details with the thoroughness of his training, but had been unable to provide any rational explanation for them. Most disturbing of all was Alice's final letter to her sister, discovered among her possessions after her death, in which she described not only the sensation of drowning, but specific details about the other deaths, names and circumstances she should have had no way of knowing. The weight of this accumulated evidence had begun to affect both Dr. Barker and Miss Vale, in ways that extended far beyond their professional interests. They found themselves meeting in the archives with increasing frequency, drawn together by the shared burden of knowledge that seemed too dangerous to bear alone. The rational explanations they had initially sought, coincidence, suggestion, fraud, had crumbled beneath the weight of documented evidence, leaving them to confront possibilities that challenged the very foundations of their understanding. Miss Vale had begun to experience her own water dreams, visions of drowning that came upon her in the early hours of morning, leaving her gasping and disoriented in her narrow bed. Dr. Barker found himself avoiding the river paths he had once enjoyed, unable to look upon moving water without thinking of the 4 young women whose deaths had become the central mystery of his professional life. The question that haunted them both was whether Mary Ann represented the continuation of this pattern or its culmination, whether her memories were a gift or a curse, whether their investigation was an act of scientific inquiry or an invitation to forces better left undisturbed. The spring of 1902 brought with it a series of developments that seemed to accelerate the already disturbing trajectory of Mary Ann's case. Dr. Barker had arranged for a colleague from Edinburgh, Dr. Malcolm Sinclair, to observe one of the sessions, hoping that an independent witness might provide either validation or the rational explanation that continued to elude him. Dr. Sinclair arrived on a grey April morning, his skepticism evident in the careful way he examined the consulting room, noting the placement of furniture, the quality of light, any factor that might contribute to suggestion or deception. He was a man of rigid scientific principles, his reputation built upon the methodical debunking of spiritualist claims and the exposure of fraudulent mediums. Yet within an hour of beginning his observation, his confident demeanor had given way to something approaching bewilderment. Mary Ann, unaware that she was being evaluated, had slipped into one of her recollective states with an ease that suggested long practice, her young voice taking on the cadences and vocabulary of women long dead. Dr. Sinclair's careful notes, intended to document the mechanisms of suggestion, instead recorded details that defied rational explanation: knowledge of historical events, descriptions of locations, references to people and circumstances that no 9-year-old child should have been able to access. Miss Vale had made a discovery that added yet another layer of complexity to their investigation. While searching through the personal effects that had been preserved with the official records, she had found a collection of letters and diary entries that revealed a disturbing pattern of connection between the 4 deceased women. Sarah Whitmore had written to her sister about dreams of a girl with dark hair who spoke of drowning, describing features that matched Margaret Henley with uncanny precision. Margaret's own diary contained references to visions of a woman in a blue dress walking into water, details that corresponded exactly to the circumstances of Emma Bradshaw's death. Emma had confided to her employer about nightmares featuring a young seamstress who drowned in the Irwell, a description that could only refer to Alice Morrison, though Emma had died 16 years before Alice's birth. The implications of these cross-references were staggering. Each woman had somehow possessed knowledge of deaths that had not yet occurred, creating a chain of prophetic awareness that seemed to transcend the normal boundaries of time and mortality. Miss Vale had presented this evidence to Dr. Barker with hands that shook so violently she could barely hold the documents, her usual composure shattered by the weight of what she had uncovered. Mary Ann's own condition had begun to deteriorate in ways that alarmed both her mother and her medical observers. The sessions with Dr. Barker, initially conducted weekly, had become necessary almost daily as the child found herself slipping into recollective states without warning or apparent trigger. Mrs. Cotterill would find her daughter standing motionless in the kitchen, her eyes fixed upon nothing, her lips moving in silent conversation with invisible companions. The episodes would last anywhere from minutes to hours, leaving Mary Ann exhausted and disoriented, as though she had been forced to carry burdens far beyond her physical capacity. Her appetite had diminished to the point where her mother feared for her health, her small frame growing thinner as though the weight of accumulated memories was consuming her from within. Most disturbing of all were the moments when she would speak in voices that were not her own, using phrases and expressions that belonged to different eras, different social classes, different lives entirely. Dr. Barker had begun to document these linguistic variations, noting how Mary Ann's speech patterns would shift to reflect the education and background of whichever previous existence was asserting itself through her consciousness. The community's response to these developments had evolved from mere unease to something approaching collective trauma. The local newspaper, the Manchester Guardian, had published a carefully worded article about unusual psychological phenomena being investigated in Chorlton-cum-Hardy, though the editor had been careful to avoid any direct mention of reincarnation or supernatural causes. Nevertheless, the story had attracted attention from beyond Manchester, bringing visitors who hoped to witness the phenomenon for themselves. These curiosity seekers added to the burden already borne by the Cotterill family, their presence a constant reminder that Mary Ann had become something more than a child. She had become a symbol of possibilities that most people preferred not to contemplate. The local constabulary found themselves dealing with an unprecedented situation, fielding inquiries from journalists, researchers, and religious figures who sought either to exploit or to suppress the growing story. Inspector Hartwell, a practical man with little patience for mysteries that could not be solved through conventional investigation, nevertheless found himself drawn into the case by the sheer weight of documented evidence that something extraordinary was occurring within his jurisdiction. Dr. Sinclair's report, submitted to the Edinburgh Medical Society upon his return to Scotland, had created ripples of controversy throughout the British medical establishment. His conclusion, that Mary Ann Cotterill possessed knowledge that could not be explained through any known psychological or neurological mechanism, had been met with responses ranging from intrigued curiosity to outright hostility. Colleagues who had respected his previous work now questioned his judgment, suggesting that prolonged exposure to fraudulent mediums had somehow compromised his ability to recognize deception. Yet Dr. Sinclair stood by his observations, noting in his correspondence with Dr. Barker that the alternative to accepting Mary Ann's memories as genuine was to assume a conspiracy of such complexity and scope that it would require the cooperation of dozens of people across multiple decades. The medical journals began to publish articles debating the case, though most authors were careful to discuss it in theoretical terms rather than acknowledging the specific reality of Mary Ann's situation. The scientific community, it seemed, was no more prepared than the general public to confront the implications of what was occurring in a modest house in Chorlton-cum-Hardy. The psychological toll upon all those involved had become increasingly evident as the investigation progressed. Dr. Barker found himself questioning not merely his professional assumptions, but his fundamental understanding of human consciousness and the nature of identity itself. Miss Vale had begun to experience what she described as borrowed memories, fragments of experiences that seemed to belong to other lives, other times, other selves. Even Mrs. Cotterill, despite her fierce protective love for her daughter, had begun to wonder whether Mary Ann was still entirely her own child or had become something else, a vessel for experiences that threatened to overwhelm the small personality that struggled to contain them. The question that haunted them all was whether they were witnessing a unique phenomenon or the visible manifestation of something that had always existed, hidden beneath the surface of ordinary life, waiting for the right circumstances to reveal itself. The possibility that consciousness might not be as individual or as mortal as they had assumed carried implications that extended far beyond the fate of one 9-year-old girl, touching upon the very foundations of human understanding about life, death, and the nature of existence itself. The summer of 1902 brought no relief from the psychological burden that had settled upon all those connected with Mary Ann Cotterill's case. If anything, the lengthening days seemed only to illuminate more clearly the profound questions that her memories had raised about the nature of human consciousness and the possibility of its survival beyond death. Dr. Barker had ceased his formal sessions with the child, recognizing that continued investigation might cause more harm than illumination, yet he found himself unable to abandon entirely the mystery that had consumed nearly 2 years of his professional life. The weight of what he had witnessed pressed upon him like a physical force, making sleep elusive and peace impossible. He would walk the streets of Manchester in the early hours of morning, seeking in the familiar rhythms of urban life some anchor to the rational world he had once inhabited with such confidence. The gas lamps that lined the thoroughfares seemed to flicker with uncertain light, as though even the most mundane aspects of existence had been touched by the uncertainty that Mary Ann's memories had introduced into his ordered universe. Miss Vale had taken a leave of absence from her teaching position, ostensibly for reasons of health, though those who knew her recognized that her affliction was more spiritual than physical. The accumulated weight of her archival discoveries had left her in a state of profound disorientation, as though the careful boundaries between past and present, between self and other, had begun to dissolve under the pressure of too much knowledge. She spent her days in her modest lodgings, surrounded by copies of documents and transcripts of testimonies, trying to construct some framework within which the impossible could be made comprehensible. Her landlady, Mrs. Pembroke, had begun to worry about her tenant's mental state, noting how Miss Vale would sometimes speak to empty rooms, as though addressing invisible companions, her conversations taking on the quality of responses to unheard questions. The young woman who had once been the embodiment of rational education had become something else entirely, a scholar of mysteries that defied scholarly analysis, a seeker of truths that seemed to retreat further into shadow the more closely they were examined. Mary Ann herself had grown quieter as the months passed, though her silence carried a quality of profound weariness rather than childish sullenness. The memories that had once emerged with such vivid clarity had begun to fade, as though the effort of containing 4 lifetimes within one small consciousness had finally exceeded her capacity to bear such a burden. Mrs. Cotterill watched her daughter with the desperate attention of one who feared that the child she had known was slipping away, replaced by something older, sadder, infinitely more fragile. The girl's drawings had ceased entirely, her once active imagination seemingly exhausted by the weight of experiences that belonged to other lives, other times, other selves. She would sit for hours by her bedroom window, gazing out at the streets of Chorlton-cum-Hardy, with eyes that seemed to hold the accumulated sorrow of multiple existences. When she spoke, which was rarely, her words carried a gravity that belonged to someone far older, far more experienced in the varieties of human suffering. The other children in the neighborhood had long since ceased their attempts to include her in their games, recognizing instinctively that Mary Ann had moved beyond the simple pleasures of childhood into a realm they could neither understand nor share. The broader implications of Mary Ann's case had begun to ripple outward through British society in ways that extended far beyond the immediate circle of those directly involved. Religious leaders found themselves grappling with questions that challenged fundamental doctrines about the soul and its journey after death. The possibility that consciousness might return, carrying with it the memories of previous existences, threatened to undermine centuries of theological certainty about the nature of salvation and damnation. Scientists struggled to incorporate Mary Ann's memories into frameworks that had been constructed upon assumptions of individual identity and linear time. Philosophers debated the implications for concepts of personal responsibility and moral development, if the self proved to be less permanent, less individual than had been assumed. The case had become a touchstone for broader anxieties about the nature of human existence, a focal point for fears and hopes that extended far beyond the fate of one child in Manchester. Yet for all the theoretical discussion it generated, the human reality remained unchanged. A 9-year-old girl bearing the weight of memories that no single consciousness should have been asked to carry. The medical establishment had eventually reached an unofficial consensus that Mary Ann's case represented some form of elaborate psychological phenomenon, though the exact mechanisms remained unexplained. Dr. Barker's detailed documentation was acknowledged as thorough and professional, yet his conclusions were quietly dismissed as the product of overinvestment in a particularly compelling delusion. The possibility that the child's memories might be genuine was simply too disruptive to existing frameworks of understanding to be seriously entertained by institutions whose authority depended upon the maintenance of rational order. Yet even those who rejected Dr. Barker's interpretation could not entirely dismiss the evidence he had accumulated, the careful documentation of knowledge that seemed to transcend the normal boundaries of individual experience. The case files were quietly archived, neither fully accepted nor completely rejected, existing in a liminal space that reflected the broader uncertainty about how such phenomena should be understood or addressed. The scientific community had chosen the path of cautious skepticism, protecting itself from implications that might prove too revolutionary to accommodate within existing structures of knowledge. As autumn approached, bringing with it the anniversary of Dr. Barker's first encounter with Mary Ann, those who had been most deeply involved in her case found themselves changed in ways that extended far beyond their professional lives. The child's memories had forced them to confront possibilities about the nature of consciousness and identity that challenged their most fundamental assumptions about human existence. They had been witnesses to something that defied rational explanation, participants in a mystery that seemed to expand rather than resolve with each new piece of evidence. The weight of this knowledge had marked them all, leaving them isolated from those who had not shared their experience, unable to return to the comfortable certainties they had once taken for granted. Mary Ann Cotterill had become more than a case study or a psychological curiosity. She had become a living reminder that the boundaries between life and death, between self and other, between past and present, might be far more permeable than anyone had dared to imagine. The question that haunted them all was whether her memories represented a unique phenomenon or a glimpse into the true nature of human consciousness, a revelation of possibilities that had always existed but had remained hidden beneath the surface of ordinary experience, waiting for the right circumstances to emerge into the light of day.